I should say you are now a psychotherapist, so you have a professional eye on trauma now as well.
Mhm.
Can you can you explain the physicality of trauma to people who might not be familiar with it?
Yeah, so the nervous system operates, we've all heard of like fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. So we'd have freeze at the
Sorry, what's the
bottom.
last one?
Fawn, fawn, FHWN.
I
Like,
haven't heard that one.
no,
What it? No.
like when you fawn at somebody, like people over people, we all people please a bit to like live our lives, but like overly people pleasing. Like I'll do whatever you
Okay.
want, don't worry about me. Like when a dog rolls on their back to show they're submissive, that's fawning at a
Okay.
more
Yeah.
dominant
No, it
dog.
makes
Yeah,
sense. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah. So the very bottom of the ladder, say we've got like the closest to death. So that's like that would be freeze.
Hmm.
And if you think about, I don't know if you know anything about so animals in the wild, the second before the tiger gets them or whatever, the lion gets them, they'll go unconscious. They'll just flop. So we've got freeze or flop are these two. You can freeze or flop or whatever, but they don't go and numb. They don't feel anything. Or playing
Hmm.
possum is another expression we use sometimes. The possum is like alive but dead basically. So a predator might come and find them and then be like, "Oh, this animal's already dead. That's not safe for me to eat. I'm going to move on." And then the possum comes back to life again, but it never died. So um, that's the survival mechanism of that end of the sex trade. Sorry, of the nervous system. All these words are just in my head that I use all the time. Um, that's the death end of the nervous system response.
Hmm.
So the more most threatening the experience, the more we're going to die, freeze or flop, fawn. So, and rape would be the closest experience to death that we'd have as humans. And that's why most rape survivors freeze when they're being raped, mostly. Um, then a little bit of movement up the ladder. Then we have fight or flight. So that's when there's more accessible to us. Now, somebody who's already been raped and then gets mugged or gets attacked again or something like that, they're going to respond out of a lower down the ladder place. Does that make sense? They've already been put into an experience of freeze. So when they get mugged or then they get attacked or some life-threatening thing happens, they're probably not going to have fight or flight accessible to them. Somebody who's had a very lovely childhood, nothing really bad happened to them apart from normal adverse experiences that we all have. Um, they get mugged or something, they're probably not going to freeze because their nervous system is able to access further up the ladder. But somebody who's been abused as a child, they get raped, freeze. Or something else happens to them, freeze. Or some threatening person, just a person shouting at them, freeze. Right? Or anything that triggers off that nervous system response of like, I'm under threat, I'm not okay. It happens all the time. You know, if some neighbour's shouting at me over a parking spot, I'll just freeze and stand there and wait for it to be over. Do you know?
Mm.
That's a trauma response. And, you know, it comes up in our daily lives all the time. We don't have to experience it just under life-threatening conditions, do you know?
Yeah. Any sort of big adrenaline surge.
Yeah,
Um,
any moment of life, you know, things aren't safe here. Threat. Yeah.
And it does make sense, actually, from an evolutionary perspective, that you would learn to do that self-protective thing,
Yeah.
because actually there are circumstances where freezing is the safest thing in
Yeah, like
terms of,
your body
yeah,
will know what the safest thing is to do. So we can never blame our response for fawning, you know,
yeah.
trying to people please our way out of a situation or getting very submissive or freezing or whatever we do or punching somebody or whatever it is.
Mm.
But our nervous system always chooses what it knows is the safest for us to do in that time.
Mm.
So we can never blame ourselves. It's out of our control how these things work. So that's
Do
what
you,
happened to yeah.
sorry, do you know if women are more likely to do the freeze and fawn options as well compared with men? Because they seem like, it seems to me like those are some of the few options available to you as a woman if you are just smaller and weaker than the person who's attacking
Yeah,
you.
yeah, you're probably right. I wouldn't know anything about it, but you're probably right, and you're probably right because women are conditioned so much to be pleasing and whatnot and
Mm.
peaceful. Do you
Hmm.
know? It is probably more likely that the nervous system would respond in a fawning way or a flop way
Hmm.
than maybe a
Hmm.
fight or flight response.
Yeah. So you still find now even that you'll kind of like be jolted into freezing or fawning at the sort of smallest stimulus.
Yeah, freezing, because I experience a lot of dissociation where you feel like you are not quite connected to the world or the earth. You feel quite separate, and that's a symptom of trauma, and that's a survival thing that you have to do in traumatic situations. Like, there's a spectrum as well. There's the everyday dissociation we all experience when you're driving the car, and then you realize you don't know where you are, you don't know how you got down that road. Like, that's normal, or you space out or zone out or whatever. And then it's like gets more and more severe, where I work with people who might cross the road and not even know what road they're on, or not know where they are, or people who think they're dead a lot of the time, or people who are not sure what's going on. That would be chronic dissociation. But for me, it's not so chronic, but I do experience it a lot. And that I believe that comes out of it. That comes out of like enduring a lot of trauma where you have to freeze consistently, which means you're constantly dissociating, constantly splitting from yourself, which means, of course, in your daily life, that's kind of, your nervous system is in that place of like, well, this is just how we exist, this is how we survive, just on an everyday basis. So it's important to do body-based activities and to do a lot of kind of mindful-based activities to bring ourselves back into the material reality of what's happening. It's a weird sensation, and it's just a weird one. It feels a bit like you're a ghost floating around. Um, but interaction stuff like that, where you might feel yourself freezing inside. It doesn't happen so much anymore, though.
It is so common for women who have been involved in the sex industry in some way to report dissociation as a long-term phenomenon, even after they've left, and also as a experience during unwanted sex. And I guess it again, it's sort of, you can see why it would be adaptive. You can see why it would help you to get through horrible bodily experiences, to be able to cut off from your body. But then you're left with that potentially long term, and all the like other horrible side effects psychologically.
Yeah, for sure. The thing that I deal with most is like memories and images, and I experience depression. It's really weird, actually. Like, I've always been melancholic and kind of depression adjacent, without saying I actually have depression. But since my book came out, that was a very stressful experience, and it was stressful professionally, personally, all sorts of different ways. It was an incredibly stressful time. The book came out, and everything was okay for a while. Like, as in, for me, everything was kind of okay. And nobody died. It was fine, as a result of my book coming out. The world did not fall apart. But then a couple of months after, I realized I had nowhere to put my trauma anymore. So it had all gone into the book for 10 years, on and off 10 years. I wrote a few different versions of this book. So I wrote one in 2012, another one in 2015. Then I wrote a novel. That's the one I'm still working on. As a way of kind of telling a story that is telling the things I want to tell without actually having to put my name to it and all. So it's completely fiction. But that didn't cut it. And then I wrote this version of it. So it's been like and the 6 years of that, or 7 years of that, was trying to get the law changed in Ireland as well, to the Nordic model. So I've always had a place to like pump my trauma at, or like put that energy into something that felt like I was doing something. Even if all these 2 other books I wrote, didn't actually go anywhere. They both were going to, but then I had to cancel them because neither of them felt okay. But I always had kind of, I guess, something on the horizon, or something to work towards, or something to be like, that's what I'm working for. That's where all this is going into. So if something might come to me, or some image might come, or some experience might happen related to the trauma experience, I could like write a little note on my phone, or put it into my book later if it was relevant or interesting or whatever. Or at least it had somewhere for it to go. And then I realized in May, well, I didn't realize this till like a few weeks ago, but like I was left with this, with no landing pad anymore for what happened to me. But it was all still there. So I was thinking, oh, I'll be free when my book's done now, grand. Like, I'll be over it, you know? Like, and I know as a psychotherapist, you don't get over trauma. Like, that isn't what happens. It's like a loss or bereavement. You don't get over somebody dying, but you kind of learn how to live your life with that loss. It's the same thing with trauma. So even though I knew that, I was still like surprised that I was like left with this empty void feeling, nowhere to put my stuff anymore, but the stuff was still there after I'd done the thing that I thought would be the expulsion of it, or the I don't know how, the excavating of it. You know, I thought that'll be done now. And I'll be free to move on with my life and not be thinking about these things anymore, immersed in this world anymore. The laws changed, that's great. I've got my books out, that's great. And then I was like, now what? Like, what is in my life now? Like, nothing. Like, that's how it felt. Like, obviously that's not true, but that's how it felt. And I went in this huge depression all summer. It was the worst summer I've ever experienced. I was so depressed. I had to drag myself around. And I had these like nice experiences, but like I was invited to the president's house twice, and for different events and stuff, and I had to drag myself there. I can't tell you how depressed I was, but having to put on this like, this is great, I'm so happy my book's out, and here's social media, look at the photos of my book and me at all these events, and everything's great, and I'm so enthusiastic about my book, because you have to be, you know. But it was, again, this weird splitting where I was living one life where I was unable to get up in the mornings and being late for everything and dragging myself to these beautiful events or whatever it was. And yeah, it was a really hard time. And it still is. It's like this, it's trying to come to terms with what I'm left with now, that the book is out there, which is a really vulnerable, exposing thing anyway. But also my internal world is like still full of all this stuff.